Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13.
Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North, and this is the second part of the Ernie Clarke case. If you haven't listened to the previous episode, please do so before proceeding with this one. In the prior instalment, I covered the forensic expertise which enabled police to identify the body discovered in a petrol storage tank in the northeast town of South Shields. And despite the remains having been in the tank for 9 years, the identification of 17-year-old Eileen McDougall led police to her killer, Ernie Clarke. Join me in this episode as the defendant appears in court charged with murder. On the 4th of June 1980, Ernie Clarke's trial commenced at Newcastle Crown Court, under the gauge of Judge Mr. Justice Caulfield and 12 jurors, alongside a gallery packed with press, public, and the victims' loved ones. Prosecutor Mr. Brian Walsh QC rose to provide the Crown's case against the defendant, with him outlining that they believe Clarke was responsible for Eileen's death due to several factors. They argued that Clarke was an employee at Velva Liquids, therefore would have known the layout of the site and had an idea as to when the tanks were cleaned, with Mr. Walsh advising the jury, quote, "It will become apparent to you that someone familiar, closely familiar, with what went on at Velva Liquids, not just a stranger, would know the tank was hardly likely to be emptied, cleaned or investigated." The prosecutor went on to address the connection between Clarke and Eileen by stating that the pair were known to each other due to Eileen's older sister Elizabeth caring for his 3 children at his home, a job which the victim occasionally accompanied her sister to. The prosecution would also disclose that although Ernie Clarke had entered a not guilty plea, the accused had confessed to his crime while on remand in Durham prison, which was a detail which made the morning newspapers the following day. However, when the court resumed that day, Clarke's defence, Mr. Humphrey Potts QC, would call into question the confession supposedly made to a cellmate, by asking Mr. Walsh what he knew about the character of the inmate to whom the confession was allegedly made. It was revealed that upon reviewing the individual's criminal and medical records, the defence had discovered that the man had mental issues and was prone to exaggerate and tell tales, leading the defence to argue that this made his evidence unreliable, a point the prosecution agreed was accurate. With both sides concurring that the cellmate's confession should be removed from evidence, the judge instructed the jury to disregard it. However, one could argue that this may have already planted seeds of doubt in their minds. Further doubt would be cast on Clarke's character, as the prosecution disclosed his supposed proclivity towards white girls aged between 16 and 21, reminding the jury that Eileen, who the prosecution described as not exactly a good girl, was within Clarke's preferred age range. Mr. Walsh went on to detail what the Crown supposed had occurred around the time of Eileen's disappearance, with him stating that on Sunday the 18th of January the 17-year-old had engaged in sexual intercourse with her boyfriend at his home, with her leaving the property at roughly 7 a.m. This was the same time that Clarke was due to start his shift at Velva Liquids, about a 40-minute walk to the north of Eileen's boyfriend's home. They theorised that the teenager had sought Clarke out at the site, and while there the defendant had made unwanted advances, and upon rejection, he had picked up a hammer and issued several blows to the 17-year-old's head, killing her. Alone on the Velva Liquid site that day, Clarke took steps to conceal his crime, including dismembering the body and disposing of the parts into tank number 1, where they remained for 9 years. The prosecutor also suggested that Clarke may have initially intended to use the boiler on the site, but found the body was too big. However, the legs which had not been found, could have been burned. There was one potential witness to the aftermath of Clarke's crime, Ronald Embleton, the former co-worker whose promotion Clarke had objected to. On Sunday the 18th of January 1970, Embleton would arrive to start his shift when Clarke's was ending, with the latter having been alone on the site all day until 2 p.m. Mr. Embleton did not see any obvious signs of disturbance, but he would recall to the court 2 incidents which occurred shortly before Clarke's dismissal on the 27th of January that year. As he took to the stand on behalf of the prosecution, Mr. Embleton would recall seeing Clarke beneath tank number 4, one of the smaller storage cylinders which had a heating element to prevent the temperature-sensitive chemical inside from solidifying. However, he noted that Clarke had been in one of the 2 channels, which ran beneath the tank, and had opened a valve on the bottom, thus flooding the area with the chemical, which, as it cooled, became a thick, waxy substance. When Mr. Embleton confronted Clarke about this action, his colleague simply replied, "That's nothing, man." Having divulged this incident, the witness went on to detail that Clarke had filled in a trench which Mr. Embleton had dug to put rubbish in, going on to claim that this was an uncharacteristic behaviour for Mr. Clarke. Asked why he had not reported these incidents, the witness responded, "It's not the done thing," insinuating that you don't tell tales on your colleagues. This testimony, the prosecution would argue, demonstrated that Clarke had been acting suspiciously around the time of Eileen's disappearance, and that his presence beneath tank number 4 is of more significance, as that was where a jumper, which was believed to have belonged to the victim, was found, encased in the solidified substance. However, under questioning by Mr. Humphrey Potts QC for the defence, a shadow of doubt was cast over Embleton's recollections. Mr. Potts produced for the court the staff rota for the week between the 18th and 28th of January, and pointed out that on only one occasion during that time did the 2 men's shifts cross, that being the Sunday Eileen disappeared, with Clarke finishing at 2 p.m, the time Embleton's shift began, whereas on other days there was a 4-hour gap between the 2 men starting and finishing their shifts, while on 3 other occasions they were not at work on the same day. So Potts posed the question, how was it possible that Mr. Embleton had seen Clarke carry out these actions, which he himself had stated had occurred on separate occasions? Mr. Embleton seemed to concur that it was possible that one of the events happened prior to Eileen disappearing, but for the jury it would be a case of determining which was likely to impact the case. The trench which Clarke had filled in yielded no evidence for the police, and the pathologist had found no indication that the body had been buried, so the question when the trench was filled in may be irrelevant. However, if the flooding of the channel beneath the tank had taken place before Eileen went missing, then the assumption had to be that the jumper found encased beneath the tank did not belong to her. Mr. Potts confronted Mr. Embleton regarding his recollections of these incidents, in conjunction with the staff rota, with the defence counsel asking him, "It really comes to this. If either of these incidents that you describe concerning the flooding of the channel and the bricking up of the channel took place before the 18th of January, did they not?" Mr. Embleton conceded that this was correct, which cast doubt on whether these events were pertinent to the case, given they may have occurred prior to Eileen's disappearance. Prosecutor Mr. Brian Walsh would re-examine Mr. Embleton, and during this second interaction, which sought to get to the bottom of the issue with the rota, the witness stated that on occasion he did come to work 20 to 30 minutes early, when he was working either the 2 or 3 p.m. shift. Therefore, it was possible he saw Clarke prior to him finishing his shifts, leaving a window of opportunity for him to have potentially seen Clarke carry out the actions he described. Having heard testimony from Clarke's co-worker, the jury would also hear from his superiors at Velva Liquids, manager Douglas Moon and his supervisor, Mr. Fennick. The latter would testify that he had reprimanded Clarke for his timekeeping, with the defendant having turned up for work late on several occasions. Mr. Fenwick stated he also suspected that Clarke had been stealing petrol from the facility. As such, he had been conducting impromptu spot checks to ensure his employee was turning up on time and his conduct was satisfactory. Meanwhile, Douglas Moon would inform the court of the issue which resulted in Clarke's employment being terminated on the 27th of January 1970. The manager of the site recalled that Clarke had voiced in a written correspondence his objection to the promotion of Mr. Embleton to charge hand and had presumptuously suggested another employee for the position. In Mr. Moon's view, this was an insubordinate act, and he dismissed Clarke. But the witness was careful to point out to the court that this did not appear to be a situation the defendant had manufactured in order to be let go from his job. Alongside these employees from Velva were various other witnesses for the prosecution, including Police Sergeant Ian Duncan, who would describe the perilous task of entering the tank where the body was found, echoing Mr. Walsh's statement that, quote, some exhibits are still judged unsafe to produce because of the possible effects on health. Sergeant Duncan described his descent into the tank and the discovery of the body parts, first the torso, then the head, but he admitted that, quote, I looked for the legs, but because of a difficulty with my breathing apparatus, I had to leave the tank. And while a thorough search was conducted by other officers, no further remnants of the body was found. While Sergeant Duncan was one of the first to have seen Eileen McDougall in 9 years, the next witness, Graham Atkins, was one of the last, with his testimony focusing on the morning the 17-year-old had turned up on his parents' doorstep on HS Edward Street at 2:30 on Sunday the 18th, 1970. He told the court that she was distressed and dishevelled, her clothing drenched from being in the rain. She pleaded with him to let her stay, as she had nowhere else to go on account of being thrown out of wherever she was staying. The witness stated that he quietly ushered her to his bedroom, not wishing to wake his parents. Once there, the 17-year-old removed her wet clothes, and the pair had intercourse before falling asleep in his bed. Graham recalled, we stayed until 7 a.m. My father came into the bedroom. I pulled the sheets over both of our heads and pretended we were not there, but he noticed. She got out of bed and left the house. Graham informed the court that that was the last time he saw her, as she walked out the door wearing her still sodden jeans and t-shirt that she had arrived in. Graham was followed to the stand by his former girlfriend's brother, Billy, who would detail how he had been to Clarke's home sometime after October 1969, and Eileen was with him. The 17-year-old's brother would also detail his search for his sister in the 2 weeks leading up to Christmas of 1969, and how he had invited her to his home he shared with his wife Marie, where Eileen stayed and briefly found work. But upon her demonstrating some concerning behaviour, such as losing her job and staying out late in the evening, Billy told her it was best to head back to South Shields, with him explaining how they caught a train to their hometown and parted ways for the final time at the Ship and Royal pub. Billy would not be the last of the siblings to see Eileen, with the 17-year-old spending the afternoon of Friday the 16th with her 3 sisters, including Elizabeth, whose time on the stand was another ordeal to compound her grief. Elizabeth, who after 9 years was now a happily married mother of 4, had a harrowing experience in the court, due to accusations made that sullied her character by insinuating that she had been promiscuous, allegations which resulted in her falling prey to the gossip mongers in the town. Now, Mrs. Elizabeth Peralty, Eileen's sibling, testified regarding her relationship with Ernie Clarke, stating that her interactions with him had started when she and her flatmates required money towards the rent, and near the end of 1969 they had taken up a job babysitting his 3 children at his home on Anderson Street while he was at work. She also stated that this was how Eileen would become acquainted with him, as the teenager often accompanied her sibling to the home to to help with the children. Elizabeth's discomfort on the stand began when suggestions of impropriety between her and Clarke were raised, with it being stated that the defendant had told the police that he and Elizabeth had engaged in a sexual relationship. It was an allegation the witness denied, with her asserting, "I was 16 then, and the man was old enough to be my father." When pressed further by Mr. Humphrey Potts QC for the defence regarding the allegations she had sex with Clarke, Elizabeth responded, "Certainly not." But the judge, Mr. Justice Caulfield, would also linger on this matter, with him also implying that she had several admirers in the town in 1969, which she also denied. The following day, the newspapers were reporting on these sordid and baseless allegations, which had been made against someone who was just 16 years old at the time of her sister's murder. Elizabeth would maintain that they were untrue, but she had to live not only with the heartache of her sister's death, but the cruelty and judgment of those around her. One other witness who would testify against Clarke was his second wife, whom he had married after he moved to Hull towards the end of 1970. Yet, like his first marriage, this one was short-lived, with the couple divorcing in 1977. The ex-wife had since remarried, and the evidence she gave on the stand, according to the team behind BBC's Rough Justice, was unremarkable, except for her recollection that during one argument, Clarke had struck her with his hand. However, this testimony seemed to have little impact, as the judge omitted it from his summing up. Having heard from various character witnesses, the prosecution would also call upon the expert testimony of Dr. Harishandra Ranasinghe, who had conducted the post-mortem. He detailed that Eileen had been killed by 6 blows to the head, inflicted while she was in a standing or seated position. The doctor stated that these wounds could have been delivered by a hammer similar to the ones found at the Velva site. With regards to the dismemberment of the body, he believed this had occurred on rough ground due to the impressions left on the skin and the fact that stones were embedded within it. He had also deduced that a sharp kitchen or sheath knife had been utilised to carry out the dissection. His testimony would be reflected in the prosecution's speech to the jury, during which they were reminded that the jumper recovered from the waxy substance beneath Tank 4 had been slit all the way up the middle, in the same manner as the torso, going on to ask the jury whether they thought these cuts were made, quote, "in the process of dismembering the body, or to remove them more quickly and more easily from a body that was already dead." On the 6th day of the trial, Ernie Clarke was summoned to take the stand in his own defence. The 49-year-old began by denying the allegations of murder placed against him, and as he had done during his police interviews, he presented an open and compliant nature as he detailed how he had sought out the assistance of someone to care for his 3 children following the breakdown of his first marriage. Effectively a single father, he required someone to care for his children while he was out at work, and that is how he came to be acquainted with Elizabeth McDougall and her flatmate Sue Sutherland, and it was through his association with them that he became familiar with Eileen, purely because she would accompany her sister to the babysitting job. He repeated his claims that he had been intimate with Elizabeth and Sue. As stated, this has been denied by both girls, but he told the court he had no such relationship with Eileen, and that she had never been to his home on her own. During cross-examination by Mr. Walsh, Clarke was presented with a photograph of the 2 sisters, Eileen and Elizabeth, who were very close in age, and Clarke agreed with the prosecution's assertion that the 2 looked almost identical. Clarke also admitted that he had been attracted to Elizabeth, and when asked if he thought Eileen was pretty too, he replied, "There's no reason to say no." Pursuing the suggestion that Clarke was attracted to Eileen, Mr. Walsh recalled to the court testimony by another witness, who had stated the 17-year-old being, quote, "a bit of a tease," with the prosecutor going on to ask the defendant whether she had been that way towards him. Clarke responded, "I would not like to say I found Eileen anyway. I didn't know much about Eileen and I didn't try to find out, adding, "She did not behave like that in my presence." Mr. Walsh pressed Clarke further by asking, "You fancied Eileen and you thought you would try to have sexual intercourse with her. Is that right?" Clarke responded, "That would be your opinion, but not mine, because I didn't have any reason to try and have intercourse with her." Unsatisfied with this answer, Mr. Walsh put forth the suggestion, quote, "She refused you, and you became angry and hit her." "Why should I? What motive should I have?" replied the defendant. Addressing the incidents which Mr. Embleton had allegedly seen, Clarke refuted that these had occurred. He stated he could not recall filling in a trench that had been dug by his co-worker. Going on to address the draining of tank number 4, he disclosed that part of his role was to operate the valves, but he would not open the valve on the tank without due cause, as, quote, "You just open a valve and waste liquid." Nor did he have any reason to be bricking up the wall which ran beneath the tank. Pressed for more details by the prosecution, Clarke reported that it was common knowledge for all site employees that the chemical in tank 4 solidified when cooled, adding that the presence of the 5 tons found by police could have been due to an ordinary or accidental spillage. When asked about the presence of the clothing, which was within the waxy substance, Clarke suggested that they may simply have been rags used by the employees to wipe their hands and equipment, with them often being cast to the ground after use, with the defendant expressing his surprise that the police hadn't found more of them. Mr. Walsh, QC, questioned whether Clarke had any doubts regarding the identity of the body, to which the defendant responded that he believed that the police were correct, that it was Eileen due to the evidence presented in regards to her fingerprints and description. When asked if he was responsible for her death, Clarke agreed that the 17-year-old had met a horrible end, adding, "But it wasn't done by me." Based on the prosecution's assertion that the individual who killed Eileen had to have knowledge of the Velva liquid site, Clarke was asked whether he concurred with this, eliciting the response, "It is a possibility." With him agreeing with this premise, Clarke was then asked about his dismissal just 2 weeks after Eileen's disappearance. The prosecution alluded that this wasn't just a coincidence and suggested that Clarke had orchestrated it, either out of guilt or a desire to be away from the site should the body be found. Clarke denied that this was the case, adding that he had remained in South Shields for roughly 9 months, trying to secure employment before moving to Hull in September 1970. His testimony would close in the same way it began, with Ernie Clarke rejecting the accusation that he had murdered Eileen McDougall. Having heard all the witnesses and been shown the evidence, there was one last task to undertake prior to the judge's summing up, and that was a visit to the Velva site, where the body of Eileen McDougall had lain undiscovered for 9 years. Changes had been made to the complex in the years since her disappearance. New fencing had been erected to strengthen security around the perimeter. But on a whole, the site, although showing signs of decay, remained mostly unchanged in terms of its layout. The 40-foot vertical ladder, which the prosecution claimed was used by the killer to access the top of the tanks, was still in place, giving the jurors an opportunity to see the precarious nature of the culprit's task in scaling the structure while carrying the body. At the top of the ladder, the suspect would have had to traverse a narrow raised walkway in order to gain access to Tank 1. From there, he would have to cross the roof to reach the hatch on the opposite side through which the body was deposited. The site visit allowed the jury to visualise not only the route taken by the killer, but the proximity of the complex to the river on its northern border, with its jetty protruding from the shoreline, while its southern border, where the site entrance was located, was passed by a road. Beyond this, a steep embankment leading to the raised prominence known as Low Top. This elevated stretch of land was populated by houses, businesses and footpaths, providing a view of the tops of the various tanks on the side and the River Tyne beyond. The fact Low Top provided a prominent view of the side, combined with the seemingly intricate nature of accessing the roofs of the tanks, was, the prosecution argued, a sign that the killer had to be someone who was familiar with the complex, whose presence would not be deemed suspicious, such as an employee. Returning to the courtroom, the jury were addressed by the judge, who summed up the case for them. Justice Caulfield referred to the visit to the complex and asked the jury to consider that now they had seen the crime scene, whether they believed the killer was someone with knowledge of the site, or was it feasible that a stranger could have located the deposition point. He went on to highlight that the canvas bag and rope, which had been used to contain the body parts, were readily available on the complex, but could also have been brought to the site by the vessels which called at the jetty. So had a stranger utilised them, as they were conveniently there? Or had the perpetrator used their knowledge of the complex to their advantage by using items which could only be connected to the site and not to them personally? Justice Caulfield cautioned the jury about drawing the conclusion that Clarke's acquaintance with Eileen automatically implied guilt. Proceeding to list the names of the Velva employees, he stated that the jury may conclude that by reason of ignorance, these individuals could be ruled out as suspects based on them not knowing Eileen. However, he would go on to add that the 17-year-old seemed to be a familiar figure around South Shields and had many acquaintances, including 2 males she was known to have been intimate with, and the question for the jury to consider was whether another individual known to Eileen could have deposited the body. Or did they believe that on the basis of the evidence presented to them, combined with Clarke's connection to both Velva Liquids and Eileen, that the defendant was the most likely suspect? Judge Caulfield would reference a statement made to the court regarding Clarke's response upon being informed by police that he was the only Velva employee who was known to be associated with Eileen. He reminded them that Clarke had expressed that he was worried about this. However, the jury were cautioned that, quote, "This is not an admission. He would be worried. You would be worried if you were being questioned in respect of a crime which had been committed, if, though you were there, you had not committed it." Having instructed the jury that they had to form their verdict based on all the evidence they had been presented, and should only find Clarke guilty if they believed without any doubt that he was the individual who ended the life of 17-year-old Eileen McDougall. At 11:43 a.m. on Thursday the 12th of July 1980, the jury quietly filed from the courtroom, and for 5.5 hours they deliberated on all the aspects of the case, before returning to deliver a unanimous guilty verdict. After 9 years of searching for their loved one, mistakenly catching glimpses of her in a crowd, or praying that every time someone knocked on the door, they would find her standing on the doorstep, the family had finally learned of Eileen's fate. In doing so, they lost the hope they had harboured for almost a decade. They not only had to contend with the grief upon being told Eileen was dead, but the distressing details of her demise. As the news of Eileen's murder began to spread, they were met with scrutiny regarding their ability as parents, or in Elizabeth's case, allegations of promiscuity. The family were forced to face all of this while also preparing for the trial, another ordeal during which they would see the man whom police had deemed had taken their loved one from them. So as the verdict was read, it was understandable that all these emotions came to the surface, with Agnes McDougall breaking down, and as the tears welled in her eyes, she was comforted by her children. Meanwhile, Ernie Clarke, the man responsible for their pain, showed no emotion as he was taken from the dock. It had been a case which showed how vital the expertise of individuals such as pathologist Dr. Harishchandra Ranasinghe and Mr. Derek Jackson from the dental school at Newcastle University can be in helping to not only identify an individual, but also find clues to point to a potential suspect. Some could argue that there were too many circumstantial details connecting Clarke to the case for them to merely be coincidences. He worked where the body was found, meaning he had knowledge of the site, And on the day Eileen disappeared, he was working alone from 7 a.m. till 2 p.m, giving him time not only to carry out the murder, but cover up his crime. He knew Eileen and had an attraction to girls of her age and appearance. Finally, he had been seen flooding the passage beneath Tank 4 around the time of Eileen's disappearance. This detail, combined with the discovery of clothing that was said to belong to the teenager, suggested that he had purposely filled the area in order to cover his tracks. As Clarke began his prison sentence, the whole Daily Mail sought out the opinions of those who had known him while he was living in Humberside. Was he a man who was quick to anger and likely to lash out? Had he made inappropriate advances towards teenage girls? Did he make those around him feel uncomfortable or uneasy? It seemed through this article, published by the paper, that he hadn't done any of these, with one of his neighbours expressing her surprise that he could be capable of murder, stating, "He always seemed a smashing, quiet chap. I never really knew him as a neighbour, just someone who I would say hello to in the street. I know his 3 children and can't believe that he could do something like that." The owner of a betting shop that Clarke frequented recalled their interactions, describing him as a good client. He was never any trouble, never aggressive, and seemed popular with the rest of the clients. However, as with many cases I have covered, the killer doesn't always stand out in a negative manner. Some have been pillars of the community, friendly and helpful neighbours, or the unassuming individual you would never guess was capable of committing a heinous crime. And while some struggled to comprehend this, others accepted the verdict, except for the man who had been found guilty. Ernie Clarke remained adamant that he was innocent, and within days of the verdict, it was announced he would appeal his conviction. In May 1981, his case was heard before Lord Justice Dunn, alongside Mr. Justice Milmore and Mr. Justice Drake. The latter, as I stated, would go on to oversee Jeremy Bamber's trial. The 3 judges heard both sides of the argument, with the Crown reiterating Clarke's familiarity with the victim, as well as his knowledge of the Velva complex, adding that he had been observed carrying out unnecessary tasks, such as draining tank number 4 around the time that Eileen disappeared. The Crown proceeded by claiming that Clarke had engineered his own dismissal and moved away from South Shields as soon as he had secured work and accommodation, possibly through guilt or desire to distance himself from his crime. And while it was argued by Clarke's representatives that the case should not have gone before a jury, Lord Justice Dunn would retort, quote, "It would have been positively wrong for the judge to have withdrawn the case from the jury on the state of the evidence as it then stood." The judge continued, "The jury might have come to a different conclusion, but they saw the witnesses, including the applicant and the side. It was their duty to make up their minds, after a proper direction from the judge, to whether this applicant was guilty or not guilty, and came to a unanimous verdict of guilty. This court feels no lurking doubt about the verdict. It was essentially a matter for them, and it is not our duty to monitor their decision." The 3 judges did concur that the evidence against Clarke was entirely circumstantial, but they considered that there was no lurking doubt about the unanimous verdict of guilty given by the jury. With this judgment, Clarke's life sentence was upheld, but murmurings that he may have been a victim of a miscarriage of justice would result in the BBC investigative series Rough Justice becoming involved. Join me next time as I delve into their investigation and findings.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.